William received the leak before a single journalist ever did, and that timing alone tells you everything about how deeply the palace had already begun preparing for war. A quiet phone call made by someone still inside Camilla's own orbit placed the truth in his hands weeks before the story ever reached the press. And Camilla, still moving through her public duties as though nothing had shifted, had no idea the ground beneath her had already changed. The real question was never whether the story would break. It was who William would become once he held it first. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next royal investigation. Stories like this rarely end where they begin. But to understand why William was told before anyone else, we have to go back to the person who made that call and what pushed them to make it. The call came on an ordinary evening, the kind that leaves no trace in any official diary. William was not at his desk when it happened, and he was not surrounded by advisors taking notes. He was simply a man who picked up his phone and heard something that would quietly rearrange the next several months of his life. No journalist had made a single inquiry yet. No headline had been drafted. No palace press officer had fielded a single question. And still, William already knew. That is the detail worth sitting with before anything else, because it inverts the entire shape of how these stories are supposed to unfold. In the usual version, the family finds out when the public does scrambling to respond to a headline that is already detonated. This time, the sequence ran backward. The most powerful man in the institution held the truth in private, turning it over in silence long before anyone with a press pass had the faintest idea anything was wrong. What he was told was not a rumor dressed up as fact. It was specific: a private trip, a vessel that did not belong to the crown, a guest list that had no business existing in Camilla's world, and crucially, a complete absence of any record inside the palace's own system. The kind of absence that does not happen by accident in an institution built on documentation. Somewhere, someone had made a decision to keep this off the books, and William now understood exactly how deliberate that decision had been. He did not react the way people expect a betrayed son-in-law or a furious heir to react. There was no outburst, no immediate flurry of phone calls to advisors, no dramatic gesture. Those close to him described something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling: a long silence, the kind that precedes a decision rather than an emotion. William has never been a man who processes shock out loud. He absorbs it, and then he moves. What makes this moment so difficult to explain away later is the timing itself. A routine filing, the sort of document that exists purely for insurance and registry purposes, had placed a vessel at a specific location on a specific date. It should have meant nothing to anyone outside a small circle of maritime administrators. Instead, it became the first loose thread in a story that was never supposed to be pulled. And someone inside that small circle, someone who understood exactly what the filing implied, chose to make sure William saw it before anyone else did. Consider what that choice actually required. It meant identifying William specifically as the person this information needed to reach. Not a journalist looking for a byline. Not a rival family member looking for leverage. William, the future king. The person whose approval, or at least whose attention, apparently mattered more in that moment than institutional loyalty to the woman the information would damage. That is not a small thing to sit with. Somewhere inside a world of financiers, private staff, and guests who valued their own discretion above almost everything else, one person looked at what they knew and made a calculated bet about where power in the monarchy was actually settling. They were not protecting Camilla. They were not protecting the palace as a whole. They were positioning themselves in relation to William specifically, which tells you something about how the internal map of loyalty inside that world had already begun to redraw itself long before the public had any reason to suspect a redrawing was underway. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere in the days that followed has been described by those close to the household as unusually still. Not tense in the way a shouting match is tense, but still in the way a room becomes still, right before someone makes an irreversible decision. William reportedly said very little to his own staff at first. He read, he reread. He asked for specific documents to be pulled together quietly, without any wider circulation, without triggering the kind of internal chatter that tends to precede a leak of its own. And that restraint is itself a signal, because William's pattern, according to those who have watched him operate for years, is never loud. He does not warn people that consequences are coming. He does not offer a chance to prepare a defense. He gathers what he needs in private until the moment he is ready to act, and by the time anyone realizes what is happening, the decision has effectively already been made. The public announcement, if it ever arrives at all, tends to function less as news and more as confirmation of something that was settled long before, which raises the uncomfortable question sitting underneath everything else in this story. If William already knew quietly, privately, with documentation in hand, while Camilla continued moving through her public schedule as though nothing had shifted beneath her, then the real drama was never going to be the moment the story became public. The real drama was already happening invisibly inside a silence that Camilla herself had no way of detecting. She had no reason to suspect anything was different. Her diary looked the same. Her staff behaved the same. The rhythm of her public life had not yet been touched. But somewhere across the palace grounds, a folder was quietly being assembled, one document at a time, and the person holding it had already decided how this was going to end. But the identity of that source would soon become the most dangerous secret in the palace. Knowledge inside a family like this one is never a neutral thing to hold. It carries weight, and William now carried more of it than anyone else in his immediate circle, including his own father. That imbalance alone would reshape the emotional temperature of the palace long before a single headline appeared, because information of this kind does not stay contained. It seeps outward through tone, through hesitation, through the small silences that people who live in close proximity to each other learn to read. Catherine was the first to know, and by every account the only person William trusted with the complete picture in those early days. Their conversations, according to those close to the household, were not dramatic. There was no raised voice, no expression of shock performed for anyone else's benefit. What existed instead was a kind of methodical partnership, the two of them working through what the documents actually meant, what they did not yet prove, and what needed to happen next. Catherine's role in this period has often been described by insiders as closer to a strategist than a spouse absorbing difficult news, and this moment was an early demonstration of exactly that dynamic. She did not ask William to soften his approach. She helped him sharpen it. Charles, by contrast, existed in a strange and uncomfortable middle position. He had been told something, but not everything. The version that reached him arrived, filtered, softened, presented in the language of a casual personal update rather than a formal disclosure requiring scrutiny. He knew broadly that Camilla had taken a trip. He did not know who owned the vessel she had been on, what financial interests connected to it, or what a routine registry filing had just exposed. This gap between what Charles believed he knew and what William actually knew would become one of the most consequential details in the entire story, because it meant the two men were in effect operating from two different versions of reality without either of them fully realizing it yet. There is something almost tragic in that asymmetry. Charles, weakened by the demands of ongoing treatment and increasingly reliant on his son to absorb the operational weight of the institution, had unknowingly ceded more than administrative responsibility. He had ceded informational control as well. The version of events reaching him had already been shaped by people other than his son. People whose loyalties, it would later become clear, did not necessarily align with full transparency. Whether that filtering was deliberate protection or simple carelessness remains even now a question nobody inside the palace has been willing to answer definitively. And then there was Camilla herself, moving through her public schedule with no indication that anything beneath her had shifted. She attended her engagements. She smiled where smiling was expected. She continued operating within the rhythm of a life that, as far as she understood, it remained exactly as it had been for months. There is no evidence that she suspected even faintly that a folder of documentation connecting her private movements to a lobbying network and an undisclosed donation was already being quietly assembled inside her own family's household. This is the part of the story that resists easy moral framing, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. Camilla had spent decades building a version of herself the public had slowly, reluctantly come to accept. She had absorbed hostility that would have driven many people out of public life entirely, and she had done it with a patience that even her critics eventually respected. None of that history disappeared the moment William received his phone call. She remained in that period a woman doing the work expected of her, unaware that the ground beneath that work had already begun to shift. What makes William's restraint so unsettling in hindsight is precisely this contrast. He did not warn her. He did not send word through an intermediary suggesting she might want to prepare an explanation. He simply continued gathering what he needed, allowing her to move through her public duties in a state of complete unawareness while the picture around her quietly hardened into something she would eventually have no way of arguing against. Those close to William described this period as one of controlled, almost clinical patience. He was not building a case out of anger. He was building it the way he approached the restructuring of the Duchy of Cornwall years earlier, methodically with documentation replacing verbal assurance at every stage. It was in its own way consistent with everything he had already demonstrated about how he intended to run the institution once it became fully his. Undocumented trust was the enemy. Paper was the only form of protection he seemed to believe in anymore. But even methodical men carry private cost. Those nearest to William in this period noted a change in him that had little to do with strategy and everything to do with grief that predated this entire scandal by decades. Watching an unrecorded arrangement unravel in real time, watching an institution's habit of protecting appearances over truth play out again in front of him seemed to pull something old to the surface. He did not talk about it. He rarely does. But the people around him understood without needing it, explained exactly what old wound this new situation had reopened. None of them, not Catherine, not the advisors slowly being brought into the smallest circle of awareness, not even William himself in those earliest days, fully grasped how far this would eventually reach. They understood a scandal was forming. They did not yet understand it would reshape the entire distribution of power inside the palace before the year was finished. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun. Every leak has an origin point, a single person who decides that silence has become more dangerous than speaking. In this story, that person has never been publicly named and likely never will be. But the shape of their decision tells us almost everything we need to understand about how far the balance of loyalty inside this world had already shifted before the public ever caught wind of it. Whoever placed that information in William's hands was not a stranger operating from the outside. They were close enough to the circle around the yacht's owner to know precise details, close enough to understand what a quiet registry filing actually meant, and close enough to recognize that a deleted photograph had already been captured before it vanished. This was not the profile of someone stumbling onto a scandal by accident. This was the profile of someone positioned near the center of it, watching closely and ultimately deciding to act. And the choice they made was deliberate in a way that deserves real scrutiny. They did not sell what they knew to a tabloid. They did not sit on it protecting their own position within a world of wealthy patrons and quiet arrangements. They chose specifically to route the information to William, not to Charles, not to Camilla's own office where a warning might have allowed for damage control. To William directly, as though they had already concluded that his was the authority that mattered most going forward. That decision reveals something larger than the scandal itself. It suggests that somewhere inside this insulated world of financiers and hospitality and quiet influence, people had already begun recalibrating their sense of where real power inside the monarchy was settling. They were not reacting to an announcement. There had been no announcement. They were reacting to a pattern they had observed over years, a pattern of William absorbing more operational authority as his father's health limited what Charles could personally manage. The insider's choice was not just a moral one, it was in its own quiet way a bet on the future. Consider what it would have taken practically for this person to make that call. They would have needed a way to reach someone inside William's household directly bypassing the usual channels that might have slowed the information down or filtered it before it reached him. They would have needed confidence that what they were handing over would actually be taken seriously rather than dismissed as gossip from an unreliable source. And they would have needed to accept the risk that once discovered their own position within that world of quiet privilege and access could be permanently damaged. None of that suggests impulsiveness. It suggests calculation. Somebody weighed the cost of staying silent against the cost of speaking and concluded that silence carried the greater risk. Whether that calculation was driven by conscience, by self-preservation, by a personal grievance connected to the yacht's owner, or by some combination of all three remains one of the genuine unknowns at the heart of this story. What is not unknown is the effect it produced. Because once William held that information, the story stopped being something that might eventually surface through ordinary journalism. It became something William controlled the timing of. He was no longer a passive party waiting to see what reporters might eventually uncover. He was from the very beginning the person deciding how and when the truth would move, which meant he was also the person deciding what would happen to Camilla's position before the public ever had a chance to weigh in. This is worth pausing on because it reframes the entire narrative arc that follows. The public would eventually experience this story as a scandal that broke through investigative reporting, a routine filing, a deleted photograph rediscovered by persistent journalists. That version is true, but it is incomplete. By the time any of that reporting began in earnest, William had already been sitting with the fuller picture for weeks. The public unraveling that followed was in a very real sense running on a timeline William had already gotten ahead of. And there is a particular kind of loneliness in that position, one that even his closest advisors seemed to have sensed without fully naming it. William held knowledge that implicated his father's wife, information capable of reshaping his own family's internal balance of power, and he held it initially in near total isolation, sharing it only with Catherine, moving carefully, deliberately, without tipping his hand to Camilla, to Charles, or to the wider household staff who might have let something slip before he was ready. Those who observed him during this period describe a man behaving less like someone processing a personal betrayal and more like someone conducting a careful audit, cross-referencing dates, verifying financial connections, building a case methodically enough that it could withstand scrutiny once it finally reached the room where it needed to be presented. This was not impulsive anger, this was preparation. And preparation, as it would soon become clear, was exactly what the moment required. Because when William finally decided to act, he did not intend to raise the matter casually in passing conversation in a way that could be minimized or explained away. He intended to bring it into a room, lay it on a table, and force the institution to reckon with it directly. But what happened afterward changed everything. The meeting took place at Kensington Palace, not at Buckingham Palace, and that single choice of location told everyone present something before a word had even been spoken. This was William's house, William's ground, William's terms. 3 senior advisors were asked to attend. 2 came from his own office. The 3rd came from the king's household, and crucially, that 3rd advisor had not been invited in the ordinary sense. He had been instructed to appear, and everyone in that room understood the difference between those 2 words. William did not open the meeting with a summary. He did not have an aide walk the room through a slideshow of findings or a verbal briefing designed to soften what was coming. Instead, he placed a physical folder on the table in front of him and left it there closed while he spoke. Printed documents, financial statements, registry filings, a summary of an earlier trip that had been quietly noted years before and never escalated. All of it sat in that folder present, but unopened, a silent reminder that whatever conversation followed was not going to be conducted on the basis of memory or assurance. It was going to be conducted on the basis of paper. This detail matters more than it might initially appear to. In an institution that has functioned for generations on unrecorded understandings, on conversations that happen quietly and are never written down, William's insistence on physical documentation represented something close to a philosophical statement. He was not simply presenting evidence. He was declaring through the very format of his presentation that the era of handling difficult matters through discreet, undocumented conversation was over, at least as far as he was concerned. He asked one direct question of the official from his father's household, who had known about an earlier version of this situation, one that had surfaced quietly years prior, and why had it never been escalated? The official, a man with many years of palace experience, struggled to answer clearly. He acknowledged that the earlier matter had been noticed at the time. He could not say with any confidence who had made the decision to let it drop without further scrutiny. That vagueness did not sit well with William, and by every account he made no effort to hide his dissatisfaction. What followed, according to someone with direct knowledge of the meeting, was not loud. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation of the kind that might play well in a film. It was quieter than that, and in its own way far more uncomfortable, because William simply continued walking through the documentation step by step, refusing to let the conversation move forward until each piece had been acknowledged. And this is where the story's central revelation surfaces, the detail that reframes everything discussed until this point. The earlier situation, the one nobody in that room wanted to address directly, had in fact been flagged once before by a palace official years earlier. A quiet conversation had taken place. Nothing had been formally recorded. The matter had simply been allowed to disappear, absorbed into the institution's long habit of protecting its own comfort over its own transparency. William had not known about that earlier flag until recently. Now he did. And the moment he understood that this was not an isolated lapse, but part of a pattern quietly known, quietly buried, and allowed to repeat itself, the entire character of the situation shifted in his mind. This was no longer a story about one unfortunate trip. It was a story about an institution that had, on at least one prior occasion, chosen convenience over honesty and had done so with full awareness of what it was choosing. William asked the question that mattered most. At what point had his own father actually been informed, and how completely? The answer that came back was complicated in exactly the way that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Charles had been told something, but only in the loosest possible terms, the way a spouse might casually mention an upcoming trip without offering any of the underlying detail. He had not been told who owned the vessel in question. He had not been told about the layered ownership structure behind it, the lobbying history connected to the people involved, or the financial contributions that had since been uncovered. Whether he had ever thought to ask further was a question nobody in that room seemed willing to answer aloud. William sat with that answer in silence for a moment before responding. He said, according to the account later shared, that his father had not known because the systems meant to protect that knowledge had failed. Not failed accidentally, failed structurally in a way that had allowed information to be filtered and softened before it ever reached the person who most needed to see it clearly. From there, he laid out 3 specific demands: a full written disclosure of both trips delivered to the king's principal private secretary within a defined window, a complete review of every patronage connected to outside donors, and an immediate suspension of any further contact between the relevant household and the individuals involved. These were not requests offered for discussion. They were presented as the minimum standard required to move forward. The official from the king's household left that meeting with instructions to deliver, and everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted in how difficult matters would be handled going forward. The folder remained closed for most of the conversation, and yet its presence alone had done more work than any speech could have. Only later would William discover just how far that earlier silence had spread through the institution. Once William's 3 demands left that room at Kensington Palace, the story stopped being a private family disagreement and became something closer to a constitutional process. This distinction matters because it marks the moment the monarchy itself as a system became an active participant in the unfolding events rather than a backdrop to them. Private secretaries were briefed, legal advisors were consulted on how existing transparency rules applied to undeclared hospitality. Internal review procedures, normally reserved for matters of genuine institutional consequence, were quietly activated. What makes this phase of the story so different from everything that preceded it is the shift in language. Where earlier conversations had circled around loyalty, family, and personal disappointment, the conversations happening now were structured entirely around procedure, disclosure requirements, reporting thresholds, the internal system that governs how senior royals must declare gifts, travel, or lodging above a certain value. Camilla's July trip, when checked against that system, appeared nowhere. Not a partial entry, not a delayed filing, nothing at all. That absence became the technical foundation of everything that followed because it transformed the situation from a matter of judgment into a matter of compliance. A royal could in theory argue that a personal relationship or a private holiday fell outside the bounds of public scrutiny. It became far harder to make that argument once transparency obligations the palace itself had spent recent years strengthening in the aftermath of previous scandals were shown to have been simply ignored. Charles found himself in an increasingly difficult position throughout this period. He had personally endorsed the broader push toward institutional transparency, understanding it as necessary insulation against the kind of reputational damage that had already cost the family so much through prior controversies. Blocking a review now, even quietly, even out of personal loyalty to his wife, would have meant contradicting a set of principles he had publicly stood behind. He could not simply instruct the process to stop without undermining the very reforms he had spent recent years championing. When Camilla's team was first approached with the specific questions raised by William's documentation, their initial response characterized the trip as a private matter not requiring further explanation. On its surface, this might have worked had the circumstances been different. A holiday self-funded involving no outside financial relationships connected to royal patronage work genuinely could be treated as a personal matter beyond public accountability. But that framing collapsed immediately once set against the actual facts on the table. The trip had been hosted by someone whose company held clear financial connections to entities tied to royal charitable work. At that point, the situation stopped being personal and became definitionally a conflict of interest, precisely the category of behavior the palace's own updated guidance had been designed to prevent. William's office challenged that initial response within days, and multiple sources close to the situation described the pushback as direct without diplomatic softening, without routing through layers of assistance designed to cushion difficult messages. The demand was straightforward. A complete account of how the trip had been financed needed to reach senior officials without further delay. That account did not arrive on the expected timeline, and its absence only deepened suspicion inside the review process. Then came the detail that transformed the situation from serious to genuinely alarming. Palace sources speaking separately to two different publications confirmed that this was not the first time hospitality of this kind had been accepted from the same individual. An earlier instance dating back roughly 2 years had also gone undeclared, and that earlier instance, as established in the previous chapter, had in fact been noticed by a palace official at the time, only to be quietly dropped without formal escalation. William's team did not treat this second data point as a coincidence. They cross-referenced financial records connected to the individual's holding company against the dates of both trips and found a substantial charitable donation timed in proximity to them. They then checked that timeline against a planning application submitted by an affiliated entity for a heritage property, an application that had ultimately been rejected, but which had passed through a review body that included advisors connected to the royal household. No one within William's team suggested Camilla had personally intervened in that outcome, but the appearance of proximity between access and influence was in itself precisely the kind of situation the institution's own governance reforms existed to prevent. By this stage, what had begun as a single trip had become, in the language used internally, a demonstrated pattern. And patterns, unlike isolated lapses, carry institutional weight that individual explanations struggle to overcome. Advisors who had initially approached the matter as a communications challenge, something to be managed quietly and minimized publicly, began treating it instead as a genuine governance failure requiring formal correction. The machinery had already begun moving. Institutional decisions rarely announce themselves. They arrive instead through smaller, quieter changes that accumulate until the shift becomes impossible to ignore, and this is precisely how Camilla's reduced role began to take visible shape through the autumn months. Her household had drafted a full slate of solo engagements earlier in the year: patronage visits, charity dinners, literary events tied to her long-running reading initiative, a keynote address at a leadership conference in Edinburgh. By the time September gave way to October, a significant portion of that schedule had quietly changed hands. Nothing was formally canceled. That distinction matters enormously because outright cancellation would have generated exactly the kind of public scrutiny the palace was working to avoid. Instead, engagements were reassigned the same events, the same dates, simply handed to a different member of the family. Organizations receiving the news were told only that scheduling pressures had necessitated the change. No further explanation was offered, and none was expected, because publicly pressing the palace on internal scheduling decisions is simply not how these relationships function. But inside royal reporting circles, the pattern registered immediately. And inside Camilla's own household, it registered even faster. Staff notice these things long before the public does, because their professional futures depend on reading exactly this kind of signal correctly. When engagements begin quietly migrating away from your office, the message underneath is unmistakable, even when no one says it aloud. The staffing changes that followed carried the same quiet procedural character. In early October, 2 senior members of Camilla's team, her deputy private secretary and a senior communications advisor, were informed that their roles were being restructured as part of a broader palace efficiency initiative. Both moved into alternative positions elsewhere in the household. Neither was replaced. A second, quieter phase followed later that month when several junior staff members were redeployed to other departments. Across the year, Camilla's dedicated team shrank from roughly a dozen people down to fewer than half that number. Alongside the staffing reductions came something arguably more significant, a narrowing of the information she was permitted to see. Senior royals typically receive a range of private briefing materials covering foreign policy, domestic political developments, and broader institutional matters, materials that keep them informed enough to speak with confidence and to be genuinely useful within their public roles. From October onward, Camilla's distribution list for these briefings was quietly reduced. Certain categories stopped reaching her desk altogether. This detail deserves particular attention because information access inside an institution like this one functions as a form of currency arguably more valuable than any formal title. Being included in briefings signals that your judgment matters, that your presence in a conversation is expected, that people around you need to account for your perspective. Losing that access does not change anyone's official position. It changes everything underneath the position, the substance that title alone cannot replace. Catherine's increasing visibility throughout this period offered a quiet counterpoint to Camilla's contraction. She took on the Edinburgh Leadership Conference that had originally belonged to Camilla's schedule, along with several charity dinners previously assigned to her. What stood out to observers close to the household was the timing. Catherine's office confirmed her attendance at these reassigned events remarkably quickly, within roughly a week of the changes being made, a speed that suggested her team had known the openings were coming before Camilla's own staff had fully processed what was happening. That is not the behavior of a household reacting to sudden news. That is the behavior of a household that had already been prepared. A smaller, more personal detail from late October rounded out the picture. William, Catherine, and Charles spent a weekend together at a private family residence in Gloucestershire. Camilla remained at Clarence House in London. Palace sources described the gathering afterward as an informal family weekend, nothing more. But those closest to the situation understood that arrangements at this level of the family are rarely as informal as they are described, and the absence of any one person from a gathering like that tends to be noted carefully by everyone paying attention. Taken individually, none of these changes would have seemed dramatic. A reassigned engagement here, a staffing restructure there, a briefing list quietly trimmed. But taken together across a period of only a few months, they described something unmistakable. An institution reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity, doing so gradually enough that no single moment offered grounds for public objection, and completely enough that by the time anyone outside the palace noticed, the shift had already settled into place. But one final meeting still remained. The final private conversation between Charles and William did not take place in a formal setting, and it was shorter than any of the meetings that had preceded it. By the time it happened, most of the practical decisions had already been made. What remained was something more personal and in some ways more difficult, the moment where a father had to fully accept what his son had already set in motion. Charles had spent the preceding days attempting to slow the process down, not to stop it outright, but to buy enough time to understand it fully on his own terms. He spoke with Camilla directly, and by his own account to those close to him, she had assured him there was nothing in the earlier trip that required further scrutiny. It was in her telling a private visit among people she considered acquaintances, nothing that touched on any matter of institutional consequence. When Charles relayed that assurance to William, the response he received was direct in a way that few people speak to a reigning monarch, even in private. William told his father plainly that her word did not match the documentation sitting in front of him. This was not framed as an accusation of dishonesty. It was framed instead as a simple statement about the limits of personal assurance when measured against financial records, registry filings, and a donation history that told its own story regardless of anyone's stated intentions. Charles asked for more time before any formal review moved forward. William gave him a fixed window, a matter of days, not weeks. What followed inside that window has been described by those familiar with the household as some of the most strained days the family had experienced in recent memory. Charles spoke again with Camilla. Camilla consulted her own advisors. Those advisors in turn sought guidance from palace lawyers familiar with the disclosure requirements now central to the entire matter. At some point during those days, the question of an earlier unlogged meeting between one of the yacht's guests and a member of Camilla's own patronage advisory board was raised directly with her. Her response was that she had not been present for that meeting and had not been aware it had taken place at all. This answer, whether entirely true or not, created a difficulty that could not easily be resolved either way. If she genuinely had not known, then someone within her own office had arranged contact with a controversial figure without informing her, raising uncomfortable questions about how closely her own staff had been managing matters on her behalf. And if the meeting had simply not been considered significant enough to mention, that carried its own troubling implications about how seriously her office had been treating the very concerns William was now raising. By the time those days concluded, Charles found himself in a position no father wants to occupy. He could not directly contradict the documentation William had assembled because the underlying facts were not seriously in dispute. He could not fully verify Camilla's account either, given the partial and sometimes conflicting explanations coming from her own staff. And he could not instruct William to abandon the review altogether without publicly undermining a set of institutional reforms he had personally endorsed and spoken about at length in recent years. The final call between them, when it came, was noticeably shorter than the earlier exchanges had been. Charles told William to proceed. He asked only for two things in return: that Camilla be treated with dignity throughout whatever process followed, and that nothing become public without his prior knowledge. William agreed to both conditions without hesitation. According to those familiar with what followed, the formal review was already underway before that final call had even fully ended, evidence that William had been prepared to move regardless of how the conversation concluded. What Charles could not bring himself to say aloud during any of these exchanges, according to people who observed him closely during this period, was the deeper truth sitting beneath the entire situation. He had reached a point where he was no longer able to protect his wife the way he once might have. Not because his affection for her had changed in any way, those close to him are firm on this point, but because the practical space in which that protection used to operate had quietly closed around him while his attention had been focused elsewhere on his own health, on the daily demands of simply continuing to work. Camilla had built much of her security within the institution on the understanding that Charles would shield her when it mattered most. That understanding had held for years because Charles had both the will and the ability to make it hold. What this period revealed painfully and unavoidably was that the will remained fully intact, but the ability no longer matched it. And once that call ended, the review was already underway. For months, everything described so far had remained entirely internal. A sequence of private meetings, quiet staffing changes, and documentation passed between a small circle of people who understood exactly what was at stake and had every incentive to keep it that way. That containment ended abruptly once the underlying facts or fragments of them began reaching journalists outside the palace's control. The initial reporting did not arrive as a single explosive story. It arrived in pieces: a registry filing here, a recovered photograph, their careful verification work done by reporters who understood they were dealing with material serious enough to warrant real scrutiny before publication. British outlets moved first, followed shortly by a European publication with long experience tracking lobbying networks across the continent, an outlet whose involvement signaled that this story carried financial and political dimensions well beyond typical royal gossip. Once the first credible reports appeared, the pace of coverage accelerated quickly. Television segments followed print reporting within days. Royal commentators, many of whom had built careers on reading subtle institutional signals, began publicly connecting details that had previously seemed unrelated. The reassigned engagements, the reduced staff, the briefing changes, all of it suddenly visible in a new light once the underlying scandal became public knowledge. Public reaction split in ways that reflected broader, longer-running debates about the monarchy's relevance and accountability. Some commentators focused on the specifics of the financial relationships involved, treating the story as a genuine governance failure deserving serious scrutiny regardless of who was involved. Others focused more on the human dimension, a woman who had spent decades rebuilding her public standing, now facing a controversy capable of undoing much of that work. Both framings existed simultaneously in public discussion, often within the same conversation, reflecting how genuinely complicated the underlying situation actually was. International coverage added another layer, particularly once reporters began examining the ownership structure behind the yacht itself and its connections to broader European lobbying activity. This was no longer simply a story about royal behavior. It touched on questions of financial transparency, institutional influence, and the blurred lines between personal relationships and professional interest that extend well beyond any single family, royal or otherwise. Inside the palace, the public explosion registered as something almost anticlimactic. By the time headlines began appearing, the internal process had already progressed substantially. The review William had demanded was underway. Staffing changes had already been implemented. The most consequential private conversations between William and Charles, between Charles and Camilla, had already taken place. The public was, in a very real sense, catching up to a story whose internal resolution had already been largely determined. This created an unusual dynamic for palace communications staff who found themselves managing public reaction to events that had, from an institutional standpoint, already been substantially addressed. Statements were kept deliberately minimal, acknowledging the reporting without confirming specific details, a strategy consistent with how the palace has historically handled sensitive matters involving family finances and private conduct. What genuinely surprised some observers was the relative absence of direct public defense from Camilla's own office. There was no extended statement outlining her version of events in detail, no coordinated media effort to reshape the narrative in her favor. Whether this reflected strategic restraint, an assessment that further engagement would only prolong the story, or simply the reality that her office no longer possessed the same institutional resources it once had, remained a matter of speculation among those watching closely. Yet inside the palace, the public reaction was the least of anyone's concerns. There is a particular kind of moment in royal life where everything that has happened privately finally becomes visible without a single word being spoken, and this story produced exactly that moment on a September evening at a film premiere in London. Charles arrived alone. Camilla had originally been listed on the official program for the event, a routine public appearance of the kind the couple had attended together countless times before. When the evening came, she was not there. The explanation offered to royal correspondents covering the event was brief and unremarkable on its surface, a scheduling conflict, nothing further. Reporters noted the absence in their coverage and at the time largely moved on, treating it as one of the minor forgettable details that accompany any public event of this kind. Inside the palace, however, that absence carried an entirely different weight. It was in the most literal sense the first outward visible sign of everything that had been happening privately for months. Nothing about it announced itself as significant. There was no formal statement, no visible tension captured by photographers, nothing that would have alerted an outside observer that this particular absence differed meaningfully from any other. And that precisely is what made it so revealing to those who understood the fuller context. Royal life operates heavily through symbolism precisely because so much of what actually happens inside the institution cannot be stated directly. Who attends an event, who stands where in a formal photograph, who is seated beside whom at a state occasion, these details carry meaning that would take paragraphs of explanation to convey through language, but which register instantly and unmistakably to anyone fluent in reading them. An empty seat in this context is never simply an empty seat. For Camilla, the absence marked something quietly definitive. It was the first time her reduced role within the institution had produced a visible public consequence rather than an internal administrative one. The reassigned engagements, the smaller staff, the narrowed briefings, all of that had unfolded behind palace walls, invisible to anyone without direct knowledge of the household's internal workings. This was different. This was the outside world witnessing, however unknowingly, the first tangible edge of a transformation that had been building for months. What makes this moment particularly poignant, according to those who observed Charles that evening, was his own visible composure. He gave no indication through his public demeanor that anything unusual was occurring. He engaged with the event exactly as he would have under ordinary circumstances, offering no hint to the assembled press or public that the woman who should have been beside him was absent for reasons far more complicated than a scheduling overlap. That composure itself says something important about the position Charles now occupied. He could not publicly acknowledge what was actually happening without risking further scrutiny of a situation the palace was still working to manage privately. He could not simply produce Camilla for the appearance, either, given the internal review still actively underway. What remained was the only option available to him, appearing exactly as expected, offering the public nothing beyond the ordinary rhythm of royal life while privately absorbing the full weight of everything that had changed. For those inside the palace watching the coverage of that evening, the significance was unmistakable, even though it would take weeks before broader public commentary caught up to what that absence had actually represented. It was the first crack visible from the outside, small enough to be dismissed by anyone without deeper knowledge, but unmistakable to those who understood exactly what had been happening behind the scenes for months. It was the first visible crack the outside world had seen, but far from the last. Months after that quiet phone call first reached William, long after the folder had been opened, the review completed and the story had run its course through public commentary, the picture that remained was not the dramatic collapse many observers had initially expected. Camilla did not lose her title. She continued to appear beside Charles at state occasions, dressed exactly as the role required, present in every official photograph where her presence remained expected. On paper, almost nothing had changed. She was still unmistakably queen consort. But the space around that title had been quietly, permanently altered, and anyone paying close attention understood the difference between holding a position and holding the substance that once filled it. Her diary remained thinner than it had been at the start of the year. The staff who once supported her work across a wide range of patronages numbered fewer than half of what they had before. The private briefings that once kept her informed on matters ranging from foreign policy to institutional planning continued to arrive selectively, filtered incomplete compared to what she had once received as a matter of course. And the woman increasingly filling the public spaces she had once occupied. The leadership conferences, the charity dinners, the literary events was consistently Catherine. This is in many ways the quietest and most effective form removal can take inside an institution like this one. There was no formal announcement stripping Camilla of anything. There was no press conference, no statement explaining a change in her responsibilities, nothing that offered the public a clear, singular moment to react against. Instead, there was simply a slow, cumulative erosion, one reassigned engagement at a time, one staffing restructure at a time, until the substance of her role had shifted meaningfully without a single official word ever confirming that shift had occurred. What William achieved through this process reflects something consistent with everything he had already demonstrated in years of managing the Duchy of Cornwall and his own charitable foundation. He did not rely on confrontation as a tool for lasting change. He relied on documentation, on structural adjustment, on the patient reallocation of responsibility until the old arrangement simply no longer functioned the way it once had. It was by every account from those who observed it unfold almost entirely without cruelty in its execution, and precisely because of that restraint it proved more effective than anger ever could have been. For Camilla, the personal cost of this transformation is difficult to overstate, even as it remains largely invisible to the wider public. She had spent more than 3 decades rebuilding a public identity that once seemed permanently damaged beyond repair, transforming herself in the eyes of a skeptical nation from the most resented woman in Britain into a figure the country had gradually and often reluctantly come to accept. That transformation required extraordinary patience, discipline, and an ability to absorb sustained public hostility without visible resentment. She earned her position through decades of consistent, careful work, and now watched pieces of that position quietly recede, not through any single dramatic loss, but through a slow contraction that left her with almost nothing solid to push back against. The deeper question hanging over everything that has happened extends beyond the present moment toward a future that everyone involved understands is approaching, whether anyone wishes to discuss it openly or not. When Charles's reign eventually ends, Camilla becomes Queen Dowager, retaining her title and a residence, but the major estates and the deeper institutional support she has relied upon throughout her time as consort pass structurally and inevitably to William. Almost everything that currently sustains her position within the institution exists because Charles occupies the throne and remains willing to extend his authority on her behalf. Once that arrangement changes, her circumstances within the institution will depend far more directly on William's judgment than on any guarantee built into her formal title. Given everything that has unfolded across this single year, that dependency carries a weight that is difficult to ignore. William has shown through this entire process precisely how he approaches situations involving undocumented trust, informal arrangements, and relationships he believes carry unacceptable institutional risk. He has shown that his response to such situations, however patient and restrained in its execution, tends toward permanent structural change rather than temporary accommodation. And underneath all of it remains the thread that has quietly run through this entire story from its earliest moments, the shadow of a mother he lost as a teenager, walking behind a coffin the world could not look away from, shaped forever by an institution that failed in the most consequential possible way to protect the person at its center. Every decision William made throughout this process, the folder brought to that first meeting, the insistence on documentation over assurance, the quiet, methodical dismantling of arrangements built on informal trust carries the unmistakable imprint of that early loss. This was never only a story about a yacht, a donation, or an undeclared trip. Underneath everything, it was a story about a son who decided long ago that the machinery which once failed his mother would never again be allowed to operate unchecked on his watch. Camilla still wears the title. She still stands beside Charles when the occasion requires it. But the institution around her has quietly, irreversibly become someone else's to